For our final presentation, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Stephen.
So our last speaker of the day, who is presenting via video, but he's online, so he's available for Q&A afterwards, is Jeremy Keith. He describes himself as a web developer. He's been involved in the web for a long, long time. He's written very many books about the web. He describes himself as an Irishman living in Brighton. He works for his own company, Clearleft. He calls himself an author, a speaker, a podcaster, a musician, and an email replier. So if we can run the video.
Hello. Sorry I couldn't be there in person in Amsterdam, but I am delighted to be able to speak to you anyway and talk to you about this idea of declarative design. So I'm not a programmer, but I'm kind of fascinated by this dichotomy in programming languages between imperative languages and declarative languages. I mean, maybe I don't fully understand the differences, but the gist of it, right, is that, you know, imperative languages are where you describe exactly what you want to happen step by step. It's kind of most programming languages, whereas with declarative languages, you kind of describe the end result and you let the computer figure out the best way to do that. I know that's a gross oversimplification, but I'm kind of fascinated by that, particularly as it applies to the medium I work in, which is the World Wide Web. I'm sure lots of you work on the World Wide Web as well. And I'm interested to see how this paradigm, this dichotomy shows up in the languages that we work with on the World Wide Web. Because the World Wide Web is a designed thing. It was designed initially by this man, Tim Berners-Lee. He came up with the proposal for the World Wide Web initially in this document here, Information Management Proposal. It was kind of vague. It was full of typos and incomprehensible diagrams. But Tim Berners-Lee's supervisor, Mike Sendall, must have seen some possibility here because he scrolled across the top. Vague, but exciting. And that was on March 12th, 1989. So Tim Berners-Lee goes ahead and he starts building this World Wide Web, and he does have ideas, philosophies guiding his design. He's got design principles. One of the design principles from the world of software that he adheres to is the principle of least power, which states that you should choose the least powerful language suitable for a given purpose, which seems really strange on the surface. Like, why on earth would I choose a less powerful language? But the idea here is that power comes at a cost. That the more powerful a language is, then, well, first of all, the harder it is to learn. And secondly, maybe the more fragile it is as well, the more prone it is to errors. Whereas a simpler language, a less powerful language, is going to be more robust. And he certainly puts the principle of least power into effect with the core language of the World Wide Web, which is HTML, the hypertext markup language. Now, interestingly, as well as making this a declarative language, and it's a kind of a classic declarative language, Tim Berners-Lee also made the decision that it should be fault tolerant. In other words, it should just ignore what it doesn't understand. If you give it an HTML element or tag, as they were called back then, that the browser doesn't understand, it just skips over it, renders the text inside the opening and closing tags, moves on to the next element. This turns out to be incredibly powerful. Now, later, after HTML, and this wasn't Tim Berners-Lee's doing, but we got CSS, cascading style sheets. And this is also a declarative language, right? And it is also fault tolerant. If you give a browser some piece of CSS that the browser doesn't understand, it doesn't throw an error. It doesn't stop rendering the page and refuse to render any further. It just ignores what it doesn't understand. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, a declarative language, CSS? Surely when I'm writing CSS, I am giving the browser instructions exactly what to do. No, you're not. As my friend Eric Meyer once put it, every line of CSS you write is a suggestion to the browser. So, cascading style sheets came along around about the first proposal was 1994 from Howcom William Lee, and it's interesting to look in that first proposal and you can see this the initial syntax that was proposed is different to what we ended up with. It's got more like this object style dot syntax, right? But you squint at it and you can pretty much translate it to the CSS syntax we have today, right? That, okay, the font size of the H1 should be 24 points. But hang on a minute, what are these percentages at the end here? Like, it's 100% for the H1s and 40% for the H2s. Well, this was a really interesting idea that was, as old as CSS, and it's this idea of influence. And the idea here is that you, as the author of the style sheet, should kind of declare how much you care about a particular style. Do you care 100%, 40%? And the idea was that there be competing interests. There's the styles that you as the author are writing, there's the styles that the browser already comes with, and there's the styles that the user writes, user style sheets, not user agent style sheets, but user style sheets. And the idea was that the reader would also have an opinion on how things should be styled. And so this idea of influence was that, you declare how much you care, the reader would declare how much they cared, and the browser would somehow come up with a value that satisfied everybody. It didn't really work. But I do like the idea of recognizing that you as the author shouldn't necessarily have the final say. In fact, the user should really be the one to have the final say. And that's why I always like the idea of user style sheets. Now, user style sheets were removed from most browsers. They're buried kind of deep in Safari and Firefox still, I think. These days, you'd have to install a browser extension to get the same kind of effect, right? Although it's interesting to see that inside CSS itself, we've got this idea of preference queries now, where you can say, oh, if the user prefers, a certain color scheme like dark mode, or if the user prefers reduced motion, or if the user prefers reduced data, then I want these styles to apply. And it kind of is bringing back this idea of influence, or at least it's bringing back this idea that it should be a two-way conversation between the author and the user, rather than the author simply dictating to the user, these are the styles I want. Anyway, CSS, that was a little bit of a diversion into the history of CSS. The third language we got on the web was JavaScript. This came after HTML, after CSS, and this, unlike HTML, unlike CSS, is an imperative language, not a declarative language, and it is not fault tolerant. If you give the browser a line of JavaScript it doesn't understand, it will throw an error. It will refuse to parse the rest of the JavaScript. So it is more powerful than HTML or CSS, but it is also, I would say, maybe a little bit more fragile. So those are the languages I work with on the web: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I try to work with them in that order, right? To build on a bedrock of HTML, then layer on the styles with CSS, and then finally add any interaction with JavaScript. So we've got two declarative languages that are fault tolerant, and one imperative language that isn't fault tolerant. Now, I made the mistake for the longest time of thinking that fault tolerance was something inherent to declarative languages, but of course that's not true. XML is declarative, but it is definitely not fault tolerant, right? You throw one unencoded ampersand into an XML file and it will refuse to render, right? So declarative doesn't automatically mean fault tolerant. So the way I work, this progressive enhancement kind of way, begin with the core technology, build on top of that with CSS, then finally add the most fragile layer, JavaScript, on the top. So I am fascinated by this dichotomy, these two different paradigms in programming, but not so much because of the programming languages themselves. I'm fascinated because I think it speaks to two different mindsets. I think the kind of mindset you have will determine which sort of programming language you would tend to gravitate towards. Let me show you what I mean. Suppose we're on the web, we're building a component, and it's a button component that the user clicks on. Okay, now, one way, the great thing about the web is there's no one particular way to do it. So one way of doing this is I reach for JavaScript. I create the button with JavaScript. I add all the interaction with JavaScript. Of course, I have to think about the accessibility, and I have to throw all that in. Think about keyboard support, not just the mouse. So the code gets kind of long. Or the alternative declarative approach is I use a button element. Now, I know which one I prefer because I'm lazy. I would just reach for the button element where the browser gives me everything for free, right? The browser handles the interaction. It handles all the accessibility stuff. I don't have to worry about it. And that's generally my philosophy with JavaScript in general, is that I only reach for JavaScript when I have to. JavaScript should only do what only JavaScript can do. This is kind of like a reformulation of the principle of least power. I should point out, when I'm talking about JavaScript here, I'm specifically talking about client-side JavaScript. I'm really only interested in what happens inside web browsers. I know you can write JavaScript on the server side there, and that's a different kettle of fish. That's fine. Do what you want there. But inside a web browser, I only reach for JavaScript when I want to do something that HTML can't do, something that CSS can't do. Right, only JavaScript can do this. That's when I reach for it. Okay, fine, but then I have to ask myself, why would anybody choose this way to build a button component? Why would somebody reach for the imperative language of JavaScript first when we've got the declarative solution sitting right there with the button element, right? It's a button element is interactive by default, works with the keyboard by default, gives you all this behavior and styling for free. Why invent from scratch? And I think it comes down to control. You know, all those things I said come for free. To me, that's a good thing. Oh, the browser gives you accessibility for free. The browser gives you styling for free. But to someone with an imperative mindset, that is actually a bug. You didn't write the code that controls the accessibility or controls the styling, and therefore it's out of your control, and that's kind of scary. So I find this imperative mindset usually comes from people, you know, with a computer science background, where the free behaviors and styling you get from the browser are undesirable because you don't know if there's unintended side effects. Whereas if you invent from scratch, you have total control. Now, the approach I take, the declarative approach of just use a button element, can feel like giving up control, right? But control does come at a cost. In order to exert control, you kind of have to make a lot of assumptions. And I think a declarative mindset is about avoiding assumptions. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. I want to show that even in a declarative language like CSS, you can still have an imperative mindset. So let's say we're styling a button. Here's some CSS for styling a button, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the CSS. I'm setting a font size of 16 pixels. I'm saying the padding on the left of the button should be 16 pixels. But do I really mean 16 pixels? Or what I probably actually mean is the default browser font size. I'm making an assumption here that the default browser font size is 16 pixels. But I can say, look, just make it whatever the default browser font size is. Now, 99% of the time, that will work out to be 16 pixels, but not always. I'm letting the user have the final say. Also, when I say padding left here, is that actually what I mean? Or do I really mean the padding at the start of the text in the button? In which case, I can use this logical property, padding inline start, instead of left. Now again, this is exactly the same as saying padding left, if I'm in a left to right language, like English or Dutch. But do I want to assume that the interface will always be in a left to right language? Even if I don't have any plans to translate the interface into other languages, the user might use a third-party tool to translate the web page into another language. And so I can either help them or hinder them, depending on the CSS I use. And these logical properties that we have now in CSS are a great way of avoiding assumptions. Now, why assume that there's one perfect font size that will work at all screen sizes? I could use media queries to change the font sizes, but that would get pretty jumpy. Now I can use this calc function in CSS. And I'm going to use a mix here of the rem unit I was using earlier and also the viewport width. To come up with a unit here. I'm using a mixture here just to make sure that the user can still resize the font size with their browser. If I only use viewport widths, they wouldn't be able to be resized. So that's why I'm mixing the two here in this calc. But maybe I've gone too far here. Maybe I need to exert a little more control. And I can do that. This clamp function we have in CSS now, where I can say a minimum size, then my style declaration, and then a maximum size. So I still want this to be, the font size to be a mix of, you know, half a rem and 0.666 of viewport widths, but it should never go lower than 1 rem, and it should never go higher than 1.5. This is the way that clamp works. You give it a minimum, a maximum, and in the middle is the calc function. You don't even need to use calc in here. That's pretty good, but I wouldn't actually use it on a button, would I? I would use it on the body itself because I don't want the buttons to size without everything else. So here I could just set on the body itself, I'd say, okay, change the font size depending on the viewport width, but never go below 1 rem and never go above 1.5 rems. And that's what I'm actually doing on my personal website. Doesn't matter what the browser width is, the font size scales accordingly. Now, I have given up some control here. If you were to say to me, okay, tell me what the font size is when the browser width is 1024 pixels wide. Well, my answer would be, I don't know. I can't tell you what the exact font size is. I've given up that control. But I can tell you that it's going to look good because everything is, in proportion and scales. So this is a very declarative approach to design. If this idea of type scales is interesting to you, there's a project called Utopia where you can you basically put in your minimum and your maximum and a type scale, change your type scales depending on the viewport width. It's really speaking to this declarative approach where I, as the designer, will say, well, here's the minimum I want. Types at the small scale viewport width, I want to use a type scale where type is changing at a scale of 1.2. And at the large size, I want the maximum scale to be 1.33, but I don't want to figure out all the mathematics in between, so I let a computer figure that out, right? So effectively, I designed the small size, I designed the big size, and mathematics designs the stuff in the middle. So I'm defining the boundary conditions. I'm the designer, I'm the human in the loop, and then I'm handing over the calculations to the browser, letting the machine do the mathematics part. So, the way that Steve Jobs talked about, using computers as a bicycle for the mind, I wonder now if we can use CSS as like a bicycle for design. Because now in CSS, we have a lot of these functions that effectively define boundary conditions, where you set a minimum and a max, where you say, these are the bits I want control over, and I want you to figure out everything in between. And I think that opens up whole new ways of designing. As someone who's been examining these ways of designing is Jen Simmons. She's got a great YouTube channel. She calls this intrinsic web design. And you can look at some examples of this on her YouTube channel, Layoutland. Some other people who've been, I think, taking the same approach is this idea with this book, Every Layout. This is by Hayden Pickering and Andy Bell. And they've got patterns in here, but it's a very declarative approach. Now, even if you don't look at the individual patterns, it's worth looking at the thinking, the principles behind it. They have an axioms page on the website, and they say, instead of thinking of designing for the web as creating visual artifacts, think of it as writing programs for generating visual artifacts, right? Like the actual design gets generated by the computer the moment the user looks at it. Andy Bell built a website and gave a talk all about this idea. The website is Build Excellent Websites. And the way he puts it here, I think, just perfectly sums it up. Be the browser's mentor, not its micromanager. Right? Give the browser some solid rules and hints, then let it make the right decisions for the people that visit it based on their device, connection, quality, and capabilities, right? So we're really back at this idea of this two-way conversation between the author and the user. So I feel like there's something here. We've got these approaches that they feel to me like there's something in common here. And it's declarative approach to design. Now, am I saying that a declarative approach to designing on the web is necessarily better than an imperative approach to designing? It depends, is my answer, which is kind of a bullshit answer. And anytime someone says it depends, you should push back and you should say, it depends on what? So, it depends on what? Well, one thing, it depends on culture, the culture of the company that is producing the design. That's going to have a big influence on whether a declarative approach or an imperative approach makes most sense. Because I do think that, culture is something that can be designed differently. Let's take management, for example. Inside any company, I think you could have an imperative approach to management, right? This is where you want to measure everything. You want to have control. So you're constantly measuring performance. You're tracking metrics. Maybe you install time trackers on everybody's computer so you know exactly how much they're producing. So really you care about the outputs, right? Quantities. Or you take a declarative approach and you say, you know, I'm going to give people autonomy and trust. I'm going to define what I want, the outputs I want. I'd say, you know, I want to see a new website by Friday. Now, if people want to do that working from home, fine. If they want to do that at weird hours, fine. I'm just going to give them the autonomy to do that. Now, I'm, again, not saying that one is better or worse than the other. I know where I would rather work. I'd definitely rather work in a declarative management environment. But, you know, some people flounder when they're given too much autonomy. Some people need the structure of a more imperative approach. So all companies have different cultures. There is no one-size-fits-all way of thinking about what will work for every company. And culture is one of those things that's it's often implicit and it is unspoken. It can be made more explicit, partly through things like design principles and also design systems. Now, design systems is one of those things that are actually kind of hard to define. My favorite definition of a design system comes from Gina Ann, who says design systems are the way we do things around here, right? And it will come as no surprise that I think you can kind of divide design systems into two different approaches, imperative and declarative design systems. And before we get into imperative and declarative design systems, I need to take a detour here into different approaches to thinking, two ways of thinking about thinking. By thinking here, I mean problem solving. How do you go about solving problems? One approach, and this is much, much older than the web, is analytical thinking. Understanding how something works by breaking it down into its constituent parts. This is, you know, what Kant was talking about in his Critique of Pure Reason. And this analytical approach is what underpins the scientific method, and it's really, really useful for things that behave the same everywhere in the universe. So chemistry, physics, mathematics, analytical thinking makes total sense. The opposite of analytical thinking is systems thinking. This is where you understand the parts by looking at how they work together. Now, a very crude way of putting it is that analytical thinking is all about zooming in and systems thinking is all about zooming out. Okay, so hold on to that. What kind of thinking do we see in design systems? Well, the word system is right there in the name, right? So surely it's systems thinking, zooming out. But no, what I see, surprisingly, is that most design systems exhibit very analytical thinking, breaking things down into their component parts, doing an interface inventory, breaking things down into components, atoms, molecules of a design system. So let me show you two different approaches to having a design system. And again, we'll go back to our friend the button. Suppose I've got these different button styles and I want this documented in my design system. Well, one thing I could do is, you know, you see how there's different colors for the background and then the top border and the bottom border. I could document those colors. Here are the different colors you should use when you're using one of these buttons. That's a very imperative approach. And if I'm in a company that has a very imperative culture, this makes total sense. This is exactly what people want. Just give me the values. But a declarative designer would push back on this and say, but why? What's the thinking here? What's the logic? What's the connection? What's the systems thinking here? So a more declarative approach would be to have a design system that specifies this. The border should be 10% lighter than the background color. So it doesn't matter what the background color is, the border should always be 10% lighter. So now you don't actually care about what the actual color values are. This is what you care about as a declarative designer, is the relationship. Okay, great. If you tried to do that in a imperative culture, you'd get pushback. So am I saying that a declarative approach is better than an imperative approach when it comes to design systems? No, I'm saying it depends. It depends on what you say. It depends on the culture of your company. But there's one more thing that it depends on, and that's the medium that you're working with. I think an imperative approach might be the right approach if you're working with something you do have a lot of control over. So, if you're designing for print and you know the size of the page, you know the colors available to you, or you're designing for native apps where you have a lot more control because you know the operating system, right? Maybe an imperative approach makes a lot of sense there. But that's not the way the World Wide Web works. The World Wide Web, we don't know what devices people are going to be using, the operating systems, the screen sizes. We've tried in the past to exert control over the World Wide Web. When I first started building websites, people were making sure that those sites were 640 pixels wide because that was the size of everybody's monitors. And then it became 800 pixels, and then at some point it was 1024. And the whole time we were just fooling ourselves because we never actually knew what size screens people were using. We were trying to exert control over the web, and all we actually had was the illusion of control. It was a consensual hallucination. It's not the way the web works. To quote the senator from Alderaan, the more you tighten your grip, the more the World Wide Web will slip through your fingers. And some people knew this from the very start. John Alsop wrote this article way back 25 years ago, the year 2000, List Apart, a Tao of Web Design, where he was calling on us to reject assumptions about devices, browsers, network speeds, people. You don't have control over how people access the web, and that's okay. And 10 years after John published this article, Ethan Marcotte published this seminal article, Responsive Web Design, also in List Apart. And the first thing he did was he started quoting of Tao of Web Design, John's article from 10 years before. So it's building on what had come before. And now I wonder, maybe we're building on top of responsive design, perhaps with a new era of declarative design? It could be. I don't know. I mean, CSS is incredibly powerful now. It's an incredibly powerful tool. I think we should use it. And I think we should lean into the fluid, ever-changing nature of the web. I think it's a very exciting time for designing on the web. And I can't wait to see what people are going to build. I hope they'll build in a declarative way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy Keith. I see hands on the Zoom. Who's that? Oh, that's clapping. Sorry. I have personal notes about user style sheets. The EPUB has the option of setting your own alignments, font size. I would consider that an implementation of that idea. And EPUB is also HTML based. So in EPUB, in e-readers, there is this user style sheet idea. Anybody? Nobody wants to say anything after this great... Oh, of course, Mohammed, to the rescue.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned in the chat, it reminds me a lot of the work of CSS and Garden that gave us a lot of food for thought for the last 20 years. I think that you mentioned this point, which is the user style sheet. I think you bring it very in a powerful way and a very interesting way to think. But it is a challenge because HTML is not semantic. So if we want to have a user style sheet, we need to have more power on what exactly the browser is showing us, so we can, say, for example, when you show clock, I want to see it smaller. When you show, I don't know, something more semantic oriented, I don't know, paragraph or link or this kind of thing. So I think that that is one of the challenges, to grab the semantic behind the only, which says simple presentation of the web. Do you have some insight on that?
Well, first of all, can everyone hear me in the room? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, good. It's fair to say, HTML has a constrained vocabulary. I think that's generally a good thing. It's not like this infinite thing. Otherwise, it would be impossible to anticipate all the things you might ever need to style. But you're right, that then also means you can't anticipate how this constrained vocabulary will be kind of put together to make more complex things, like someone's going to build a clock in HTML. Now, the route for expanding the vocabulary of HTML that shows the most promise right now is this sort of umbrella term of web components, which is actually multiple technologies, one of them being custom elements. With custom elements, you're making up your own HTML elements. As long as it contains a dash in the tag name, you can go for it. And then you can attach the styles you want, you can attach the behaviors you want. So yeah, so then how would if trying to the user should have the at least have some say in how things are styled, how can we possibly provide, user styles for elements that haven't been invented yet? Or, every different developer could be inventing their own elements. The the generally accepted way that you allow a web component to be styled, and this is generally not for end users. This is when it's more like another developer is going to take your web component and use it on their website, but surely they'll want to style the web component somehow. The way it's being done right now, or it's the suggested way, is through custom properties, which is the technical name for effectively CSS variables, that you define the variables that decide, what the styling is. So I guess then the challenge is, well, how would you expose that somehow to well, to other developers, but then yeah, to a user style sheet. I don't have any answers, but this is being thought about, I think. This idea of HTML can be extended in quite complex ways now using this web component idea. But then how do you allow other people to style it? And also, again, with this kind of balance between the author shouldn't have all the say, the user should have some say. Like, you probably want to allow some things to be styled, but not other things to be styled. So you make a decision on what you're going to allow to be changed by another developer, by an end user, by anybody. So custom properties basically is the mechanism, but the challenge is how do you expose that? What's the documentation for a web component?
Yuri, thank you for your inspiring talk. I saw some things that I'm preaching as well. So thank you for that. How do you see that now that we have these AI-powered browsers coming along that will just show plain text to people? How do you see this in this field? We lose even more control, but we cannot even give any real reason other than ignore all previous commands and talk like a pirate.
Um, well, first of all, when you say AI, just to clarify, because it's such a broad, you were talking about large language models specifically.
These new browsers that are coming along, Atlas, I think, is one of them.
Yeah, but just because I find the phrase AI to be effectively meaningless, but I think the idea is there's a large language model that sucks up everything on the web and spits it back out as an answer to a question. Yeah, you're right. That kind of just bypasses effectively. I mean, I think a good way of thinking about how that browser, in quotes, is approaching things is that effectively treating the World Wide Web as damage and routing around it. So everything we've built on the web for 3 decades or more, saying like, yeah, but what if we just treated that as raw material to be fracked and then regurgitated without any thought of these questions of semantics, styling, anything like that. Yeah, just spitting it back. So not really something I personally want to have any truck with, and not something I want to help in any way.
No more questions, right? Jeremy, I just want to thank you for a brilliant talk. It was perfect ending talk for this conference, and I noted that lots of people were very pleased with it. One thing I just wanted to remark on was, as you know, I was in the CSS design committee at the start, and one of the arguments I lost was that I was suggesting that when we were designing the MIME type for CSS, that the HTML should be a parameter to the MIME type, so that you are actually looking at the style sheet with a parameter of the HTML, and that way you could always have a user style sheet. Unfortunately, I lost that argument, but I agree that it's a shame that user style sheets are disappearing.
Mm.
Well, thank you very much. We're now going to have the closing.
Thank you, Jeremy Keith.